On the one hand, Israel, having sustained this terrible blow, feels compelled, not only justified, but compelled to restore deterrence, to signal to Iran, to Hezbollah, to everybody in the region that it will not stand by as Iran's weakest proxy in the Middle East, Hamas, inflicts that kind of damage, that Israel has to change the equation, it has to change the rules of the game. And I think in some respects, Israel also understands that all the relationships that it has cultivated over the last decade with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Sudan, with Morocco, of course, continuing the relationship with Egypt and Jordan, and indeed the prospect of a historic peace deal with Saudi Arabia, depend on the perception of Israel being a competent and powerful state.
And now, The Good Fight with Yascha Mounk.
We were looking forward to running an episode this week on a really interesting book by Jonathan Rauch called The Happiness Curve, about the way in which the happiness of people varies over the course of their lifespan. But given the events in Israel and the Middle East, we changed plan at the last minute and are going to have a conversation about a rather more sobering issue, the terrible Hamas-led terrorist attack that killed over 1,000 innocent civilians in Israel, the biggest slaughter of Jews since World War II, and the evolving geopolitical crisis that is resulting, including the Israeli attack on Gaza. To talk about this, I've invited Amichai Magen. He is a visiting fellow at the Freeman-Spogli Institute at Stanford University, as well as a professor in Israel. We're going to talk about a broad range of issues about how Israel could fail to predict this attack, what this means for the fate of the Netanyahu government and for the state of democracy in Israel, and of course, how this war is likely to play out, what it means for the future security of the state of Israel, and more broadly, for the prospects, now more diminished than they have been in a very long time, for peace in the Middle East. Before we start, I want to comment on something that I've been thinking about for the last days. Not the most important aspect of this whole story, but one that has felt very personal. And that is about why and how it can be that so many parts of the left and so many institutions have failed to recognize the injustice of the terrorist attacks. Why it is that some of the universities and institutions I'm affiliated with, places including Harvard and Stanford and Yale and Princeton, have made statements about all kinds of atrocities within 24 hours for the last years, but they had to be shamed out of their silence in this particular case. And I think there's many answers to that question, including straight up anti-Semitism, including a concern over the genuine mistakes that the Israeli government has made in the last decades, including the cowardice of institutional leaders who have learned in the last years that the best way to keep their job is to shut up about anything that might be controversial. But the explanation also lies with the deeply misguided ideas that so many parts of the left have taken on over the course of the last decades. The explanation also lies with the fact that they have come to embrace a concept of racism which is exclusively structural, which can only recognize racial hatred when it comes from a supposedly privileged to a supposedly underprivileged group. It also has to do with a post-colonial discourse, which assumes that people who are coded as white must be colonizers and people who are coded as non-white must be the colonized, even if the question is rather more complicated, as is the case for Mizrahi Jews who were thrown out of Middle Eastern countries who had nowhere else to go than Israel. And so the most important questions that I'm about to discuss with Amichai are about what is going to happen in the region. But one set of important questions within the West is how these institutions can right themselves. If universities worry about any little attack on the safety of their students in the form of a microaggression when the students happen not to be Jewish, but not do anything to reassure Jews amidst protests that literally celebrate those who have murdered babies and grandparents, when they make statements about every issue other than what Hamas did last weekend, then they are squandering what remains of their credibility. And perhaps they're rightly squandering what remains of their credibility. Amichai Magen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Yascha. I wish I could say I was happy to be with you this morning. Under any other set of circumstances, I would be extremely happy to be with you. But as you know, these are tragic and very difficult times for people in Israel, for people in Gaza.
Yes, I was about to say that I wish we'd convened this podcast under happier circumstances. What just happened? Tell us something about the scale of the murder and the killing of civilians in Israel over the last week, and perhaps help us make sense of that in the larger context of Israeli history.
So this is a very rapidly unfolding set of events. I think already we need to distinguish between two phases of this war. The first began in the early morning hours of Saturday, October 7th, the last day of the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, where the vast majority of Israelis were sleeping in their beds or preparing to go to the synagogue or barbecue with their families. There were young people preparing to have a nature celebration in the proximity of Gaza. And then we've entered a new phase over the last 24 hours. So let me just unpack those two, even though we still don't have all the facts. Not all of the bodies have been recovered. There are many missing. So we still don't have the full factual picture. But let me unpack the events into two. So the first phase of this war was a huge surprise, completely unexpected and unprovoked. Approximately at 6:30 in the morning, a barrage of rocket fire from Gaza into various parts of Israel began. Before the day was done, over 3,000 missiles, rockets, mortar shells were fired from densely populated Palestinian territories inside Gaza onto densely populated Israeli civilian centers. And that was consistent with a pattern of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the other major terrorist organization based in Gaza. That was consistent with previous rounds of warfare instigated by Hamas. But this time, things were different. This time, it looks as if the rocket barrage was really a decoy. It was a distraction from the real military operation, which looks as if it's been planned for a very long time. And then there's a big question about the complicity of Iran in this. But essentially, 1,500 in the initial phase, 1,500 Hamas and PIJ militants crossed the border into Israel. They very quickly overwhelmed understaffed military posts on the border with Gaza, and then made their way into Israeli towns, villages, and there conducted what can only be described as a pogrom, as a massacre. Within the first 5 or 6 hours before Israel could probably mobilize and respond, we now know that over 1,300 Israelis, the vast majority of them civilian, were simply massacred. Whether that was in the nature party that was happening close by, 260 bodies were already recovered from that site alone. But in places, in kibbutzim and moshavim, neighboring Gaza, militants, terrorists went house to house, burning, shooting, decapitating, raping, looting. It was simply a massacre. There's no other word for it. Huge trauma with echoes for many Israelis of the events of the Holocaust, and with echoes for the rest of the world of the type of behavior that we have come to expect from organizations like ISIS, like Daesh, and various Al-Qaeda affiliates around the world. So that was the first phase. But as I mentioned, Yascha, in the last 24 hours, this is mutating very quickly. And let me just summarize this by saying that this could very quickly evolve into a multi-front regional confrontation in which Israel has to face not only the two Iranian proxies that are based in Gaza, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but much more worryingly, from a strategic and a military point of view, Hezbollah, that is based in Lebanon and now parts of Syria. Over the last few hours, there are reports of shelling from Lebanon onto Israel, possible terrorist infiltration from Lebanon into northern Israel, into the Galilee. At the same time, there are early signs of a rising insurgency, or perhaps the beginnings of an intifada in the West Bank. Hamas is doing everything it possibly can to incite and to encourage people in the West Bank, and indeed Israeli Arabs who are living within 1967 borders, to take up arms against Israeli civilians, police, and military. There is also a global dimension to this, Yascha, because we see a call by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, by Hamas, for a day of jihad around the region and the world. And this could have destabilizing consequences for Jordan. This could have destabilizing consequences in Paris and in London. And so this is the situation as we speak.
And as ever, it is, of course, legitimate to criticize the actions of the government of Israel, but the line between people who claim to be anti-Zionists and who are in fact simply anti-Semites is very thin. And you can see in the call for a global attack on Jewish targets, not just on Israeli targets, the nature of Hamas's ideology. What are the prospects for the war that is now unfolding? I recognize that we're in the very, very deep fog of a war that is as much impending as it is already upon us. Was the weakness of Israel in those first days simply a result of an extreme and unusual intelligence failure? And now that the country is on high alert and is mobilizing, it can look towards this confrontation with relative confidence? Or do you think that there is a possibility of broader military failures, which would put Israel at much more risk than it seems to have been in previous wars since probably the 1970s?
So let me address first the causes of this conflict, and some are structural and some are more contingent and more recent. The structural cause of the conflict is the fact that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Iranian proxies, are committed ideologically, religiously, materially to the annihilation of the State of Israel. I invite all the listeners to simply go to your favorite browser and enter the words Hamas Charter, and you'll see in English the full set of aims and declarations of Hamas. They don't hide their intentions. Hamas is an acronym. It stands for the Islamic Resistance Movement. It is part of the axis of resistance, the so-called Mukawama. And its aim is to annihilate Israel and to create a fundamentalist Islamist caliphate on the territory of what is now Israel. It doesn't discriminate between Jews, Arabs, Druze. As far as they are concerned, they are all kuffars, they are all apostate and need to be annihilated. And the goal is to establish a fundamentalist caliphate. That is the root cause of this confrontation. More recently, I think we can point to three factors that instigated and are that help us understand the timing of this attack. The first is an Israeli failure of imagination. A certain naivete, a certain complacency. Israel, over the last 3 years in particular, believed that it could reach an accommodation with Hamas. It could offer greater economic opportunities to the population of Gaza. Over the last few months, more workers were issued with Israeli work permits to work in Israel. More money has been funneled to Hamas through Qatar and other sources. And Israel thought that this would create a set of incentives that would stabilize things. We now know that a lot of what Hamas has been doing over the last year has been to distract Israel from its plan of attack. But there was a certain degree of complacency and naivete there. Again, we don't know all the facts. Historically, after this type of catastrophe, a national commission of inquiry will have to be created after the war to investigate what happened. But clearly, this is a colossal intelligence failure followed by a colossal operational failure. So that's point number one. Point number two, Israel looked distinctly vulnerable because of the extreme polarization over the last year, because of the public statements made by Israeli pilots that they will not come and volunteer for IDF service if the Netanyahu government would continue on its path to weakening Israeli democracy. Our neighbors, Israel's neighbors, have been watching. We tend to think that Israel is very good at watching its neighbors, but the neighbors are also very good at watching Israel and understanding Israeli society. And they detected a unique moment of division and vulnerability over the past several months. There is a third reason, Yascha, and it is a strategic one. It is more difficult to prove because Iran is very good at obfuscating its operations. The nature of proxy warfare, the essence of proxy warfare, is plausible deniability on the part of the patrons. So we don't yet have the full picture. But it is clear that Iran has very powerful strategic incentives for trying to sow chaos in Israel and the region at this time. Two things really stand out. One is Iran's desire to ensure that the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel do not conclude a peace deal. And in particular, they are trying to scupper the possibility of an American Saudi defense pact, which would be a real strategic blow to Iran. The Iranians are aware that the clock is ticking because of the American political clock on the window of opportunity to conclude that deal, and they are trying to create chaos in the region. There may also be, and again, this is difficult to prove, but I think it makes a lot of strategic sense. There may also be an identification on the part of Iran of a window of opportunity where a regional war in the Middle East would allow Iran to really rush forward and to become, for all intents and purposes, a nuclear power. Iran is very, very close. We have credible intelligence estimates by the United States, by Israel, by other intelligence agencies around the world, that Iran is essentially within 2 or 3 months of being able to enrich enough uranium and to develop a detonation device. And so there are very powerful strategic incentives for Iran to sow chaos across the Middle East exactly at this time.
So that's a very helpful account of the wider context in the region. What are the immediate dangers to Israel from a two-front war? What would happen if Hezbollah from Lebanon and perhaps other forces were to start attacking Israel as well? And how do you assess at this point the preparedness of Israeli military and Israeli society to respond to that? Clearly, as you pointed out in your earlier response, there's a perception of such deep division that Israel might not be able to respond effectively. At least on that count, it seems that there is now a government of national unity, and that even though there's deep anger towards both the policies pursued by Benjamin Netanyahu before this moment and the intelligence failures which led to this attack, the ability of Israelis to close ranks for the moment because of this attack, defer any political accountability and stand together seems to be assured. But in terms of military preparedness, in terms of capacity, how worried do you think Israelis need to be right now about a potential two-front or multi-front war?
So the threat of all-out war with Hezbollah and potentially other Iranian proxies around the Middle East, let me remind you, there are a variety of Shia Iranian militias based in Syria today, based in Iraq, based in Yemen. And Iran certainly has the capacity to facilitate the launching of drone attacks, of missiles attacks, not just from Lebanon, but also from Syria and potentially from Iraq and Yemen. So the scale of this is potentially very extensive indeed. Let me just give you a sense of proportion. Hezbollah is not a terrorist organization in the way that you and I might normally think about a terrorist organization. Hezbollah is a proto-state and one of the most powerful military actors, certainly in the region and arguably in the world. At the moment, Hezbollah has about 180,000 rockets and missiles pointed at Israel. Of those, somewhere between 35 and 40,000 precision-guided, GPS-guided missiles that could hit critical infrastructure in Israel. And Israel is a very small country. It's the size of New Jersey. It has one major international airport, Ben Gurion International Airport, and its critical infrastructure is therefore vulnerable. If Hezbollah were to enter this war in full force, we would be facing a very different type of campaign, and Israel would be facing, at the very least, a two-front assault, one from the south, one from the north. But as I mentioned before, Yascha, that could potentially escalate into a much messier reality of various types of attacks on civilians and disruption of Israel's war effort in the West Bank and within Israel itself, something that Israeli military analysts have been warning about for several years now. Clearly, internal divisions and a neglect of the core functions of national defense, not only over the last year, Yascha, but I would say over the last 4 or 5 years, as Israel has gone from one failed government to another failed government, from one cycle of elections to another cycle of elections, and as Israelis have been focused on their internal political squabbles, that has certainly undermined both internal social cohesion, which is so critical for warfare. Power is not just about technology. It's not just about military capabilities. It's about spirit. And it is at these moments that the spirit of a nation is tested. We see that in Ukraine. We see how the spirit of the Ukrainian people has allowed Ukraine to face a much more powerful enemy. If that spirit doesn't exist in Israel in the coming weeks and months, that's going to make Israel's time and challenge all the greater. But I do believe, as you say, Yascha, that in times of crisis, Israelis rally. We've seen an incredible mobilization of reservists. Israelis are flying from all around the world to volunteer. The fact is that there are many more people flying into Israel right now to assist than people fleeing or people leaving Israel. And so Israel has this unique capacity for societal resilience. The question now has to be whether there is sufficient level of trust in the existing national leadership to be able to conduct this campaign successfully.
Help us understand both what is happening in Gaza, what is about to happen in Gaza, and what the plan of the new Israeli government of unity is there. Again, what Gaza did in a surprise attack, one which was not provoked by any immediate Israeli action. In fact, as you were saying, Israel was trying to facilitate a more cooperative relationship with the Gaza Strip, was one of the worst terrorist massacres that we've seen in the last 100 years. I think that clearly gives Israel a right to battle Hamas in a very decisive way, to attempt what the United States and other allies did with ISIS, which is, if possible, to dismantle the existence of the organization. At the same time, there are obviously a huge number of civilians in Gaza. There's over 1 million children in the Gaza Strip, 2 million people overall, many of whom being used as human shields and other things by Hamas. But what is the game plan here? How can Israel try to certainly cripple Hamas's ability to carry out such attacks and perhaps dismantle the organization and certainly ensure that it no longer has control over the Gaza Strip? But how can it do that without causing very serious civilian suffering, which would both be morally unacceptable and likely to backfire strategically because of the way in which it would force various governments throughout the Middle East to break relations with Israel, or perhaps even prompt them to enter a war, perhaps undermine governments in the region that are relatively comparatively moderate rather than extreme.
So you've laid out the dilemma very well, Yascha. It's a hellish dilemma. It's a catch-22 situation. There are no easy answers here. On the one hand, Israel, having sustained this terrible blow, feels compelled, not only justified, but compelled to restore deterrence, to signal to Iran, to Hezbollah, to everybody in the region that it will not stand by as Iran's weakest proxy in the Middle East, Hamas, inflicts that kind of damage, that Israel has to change the equation. It has to change the rules of the game. And I think in some respects, Israel also understands that all the relationships that it has cultivated over the last decade with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Sudan, with Morocco, of course, continuing the relationship with Egypt and Jordan, and indeed the prospect of a historic peace deal with Saudi Arabia depend on the perception of Israel being a competent and powerful state. And there's also, of course, the public anger and grief and expectation that something like this could never happen again. Let me emphasize, Israelis are not at war with the population in Gaza. Israelis understand that the population in Gaza has really been taken hostage by two callous and cruel terrorist organizations that are abusing the Palestinian people in Gaza in untold ways. And so the war here is not against the Palestinian population. There is no real sentiment of or desire for revenge. There's mainly grief and anger and sadness. But there is a completely understandable Israeli public demand that we cannot go back to the status quo. and that this must not be allowed to happen again.
So what does that mean in concrete terms? I mean, do we understand at this point what the stated goals of the government are? And I'm constantly recording this on Friday around noon Eastern time. It's going to go out tomorrow morning. By the time we're listening to this, it's probably Saturday morning. Things may change in the next 24 hours. Things may certainly change in the next 72 hours. But as of right now, what is it that Israel is trying to achieve in the Gaza Strip?
So I was about to say that Israel doesn't have great options here. What we know so far is that the war cabinet of the newly established emergency government, it's not a national unity government, it's an emergency government. The aim is, or the declared aim is to degrade and undermine the capabilities, military and political, of Hamas in the West Bank. There was also a statement this morning by Israeli Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant, who spoke about the impending collapse of, or the goal of bringing down Hamas's rule in Gaza. So as far as we know, that is the declared aim of the Israeli government. Whether that can be achieved militarily is doubtful. Not impossible, but doubtful given the constraints that you have just articulated. The population density of Gaza, the difficult humanitarian situation that will quickly evolve there, and the fact that even if you reoccupy Gaza and bring down Hamas's rule in Gaza, the question the next day is, well, what now? Who's going to govern Gaza? The Egyptians are not interested in doing it. Let me remind everybody that Gaza borders two countries, Israel and Egypt. The Palestinian Authority is fragmented and weak and probably doesn't have the capacity to rule Gaza. So there's no easy option that could give us stability. In the immediate term, it seems as if the plan of the IDF over the next days and weeks will be to conduct a land operation into northern Gaza. A notice has already gone out to the population of northern Gaza, from the northern border of Gaza with Israel all the way to Gaza City, which is about halfway through the Gaza Strip. If you look at the map, to evacuate that area and to head south. This is the kind of warning that international humanitarian law requires before a military operation, and it seems as if that is what the IDF is preparing to do. But we'll have to see how this pans out.
And what is the goal of that? I mean, I guess it means that the Israeli Defense Forces are going to attack. What the purpose of that impending operation is? So they've given the warning. They're going to go in militarily. Presumably they want to dismantle rockets that might still be pointed at Israel. They want to get rid of tunnels and other installations that have allowed Hamas to infiltrate Israel. But beyond that, what is the purpose of this operation? What is Israel hoping to accomplish through it?
So operationally, the purpose would be to seriously degrade and destroy the military capacities of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which are substantial. Gaza is a giant fortress with tunnels and bunkers, weapons storage facilities, weapons making facilities, rocket making and production facilities. All of these things exist in Gaza. So if the operational goal is to deny the capacity to continue to produce weapons and to shoot rockets from Gaza onto Israel, that would be the operational aim of this campaign. Beyond that, there is the strategic goal, which is to change the equation, to change the rules of the game, to make sure that we don't go back to the reality that existed on October 6th, 2023, where we're just preparing for the next round of attack and the next round of war. That seems to be the short-term strategic goal. And as I said, this is also has regional implications, because if Israel is able to effectively remove Hamas's capacity to conduct this type of warfare, this has implications, important strategic implications vis-a-vis its shadow war with Iran.
Tell us briefly about the implications here for Netanyahu and the fight over Israeli democracy that's been playing out for the last 12 months or so. There's mass demonstrations against attempts by Netanyahu to broaden his powers, in particular by passing judicial reforms that would undermine the role of the Supreme Court. Now there is this, I think you called it an emergency government rather than a government of national unity, but certainly it is something that's akin to a government of national unity in the sense that it unites within itself political parties that have been deeply hostile to each other over the last 12 months. There is deep and very broad anger over Netanyahu's failure to keep Israel safe, something that had always been core to his promise. What do you think the likely future of Netanyahu is, and will Israeli democratic institutions be able to withstand these coming months?
Well, I think if anything, Yascha, Israel just received a very, very painful lesson in the importance of the functionality of the state and the importance of trust in national institutions, which in Israel is inherently tied with questions of legitimacy and democracy and participation. In the short run, the efforts of the Netanyahu government to push through anti-democratic legislation will be put aside. That has already been stated. In fact, the formation of the national emergency government, the terms and conditions of that include a clause that says that this government will not promote any legislation that is not related to the war effort, which is code name for saying we're suspending the so-called judicial reform or judicial coup, as many in Israel see it. In the longer run, tremendous loss of trust, anger directed at the current leadership. And at the head of it, Netanyahu. The buck stops with him, and it will be, I think, incredibly difficult for him to wiggle his way out of this situation. If the mechanisms of democratic accountability still function in Israel, and I believe that they do, it's very difficult to see how Netanyahu is not compelled to exit the political scene over the coming months or more. I'll remind you that historically, that has been the fate of Israeli prime ministers who've lost wars. Golda Meir in 1973, Menachem Begin in 1982, even Ehud Barak, with the opening of the Second Intifada, had to step aside. And so the mechanisms of democratic accountability have worked in Israel historically, and I can't see a situation where we have such a collapse or such a failure of accountability in Israel where those mechanisms will not work again this time.
I'm going to ask you a question that I know is very hard or perhaps impossible to answer right now. But what does all of this mean for the prospects of any kind of durable settlement or peace in the Middle East? In the last years, a lot of people have been moving towards the idea of a one-state solution, of the idea of Israelis and Palestinians coexisting peacefully in the same state. That's certainly a very appealing ideal, and one that I would love to embrace and advocate. But I think terrorist attack last weekend explains in, I suppose, a more eloquent way than any essay might why that seems to be naive beyond belief at this point. You know, Gaza is sometimes called an open-air prison, but the prison gates were opened last weekend, and we saw what the result of that was. So a one-state solution seems wholly unrealistic. It is also hard to see the prospects for a viable Palestinian state at this point, both because of the encroachment of settlements in the other Palestinian territories and because of what is now likely to happen in the Gaza Strip. And then, of course, Israel's relationship with the neighbors with whom it had managed to accomplish peace and some amount of cooperation are now looking more grim than they did in the past as well. To leave us with some tiny smidgen of hope in these dark times, Amichai, if in 10 or 20 years we should somehow look back at this moment and say things didn't work out as terribly as we feared, and in some strange, perverse way, they helped move the region towards some form of peaceable settlement, what might that even look like?
Well, if there is a silver lining in this horrific situation, it is the fact that it's not only Israel that is extremely concerned about Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It's also Egypt. It's also Jordan.
And presumably, just part of a context here that I think is always left a little bit off the page. There's a reason why Egypt is not allowing people from the Gaza Strip to enter its territory, and that is that the country fears that Hamas will try and topple the Egyptian government and carry out terrorist attacks within Egyptian territory.
Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood is a movement that threatens the stability of Jordan, of Egypt, and indeed of Saudi Arabia. And so if there is a silver lining in these very, very painful days, it is that we've received, everybody in the region has received a reminder that global jihad hasn't gone away. Yascha, since the collapse of ISIS's rule in Raqqa and Mosul 6-7 years ago, we seem to have forgotten about the problem of global jihad. We've turned our attention to other problems, to great power competition. We've received a reminder that global jihad hasn't disappeared. It's back with a vengeance. By the way, there's a cautionary tale here for every country in Europe and in the United States and around the world. And if there is the presence of mind and leadership, the horrible events of the last week will actually bring Egypt and Jordan and Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia closer together. The strategic imperative here is for the pragmatic Sunni Arab world to work more closely with the United States, to work more closely with the West, to work more closely with Israel, to ensure that the axis of chaos, the axis of resistance, the axis of mukawama led by Iran is not triumphant. And so to answer your question, Yascha, where do we go from here? We need to work very carefully and determinately to try to preserve the gains that have been made in Middle East peace building over the last decades, and to try to move those forward in a way that would create a regional framework that would allow us to, on the one hand, provide the Palestinian people with the dignity and freedom they so richly deserve, and at the same time ensure security and stability, not just for Israel, but also for Jordan, for Egypt, and for the entire region. This is not a Hamas-Israel war. This is a conflict between an axis of stability, an axis of hope, an axis that respects the basic rules of statehood and international law, and an axis of chaos that is seeking to undermine civilization in the Middle East and beyond.
Thank you so much, Amichai, for laying out so clearly what has happened and what may be about to happen. I just want to close with a few personal words, because this is a time in which it's very hard to, at the same time, remember fundamental moral truths and make important moral distinctions. The fundamental moral truth is that every civilian victim is a tragedy, and that all people who die in a conflict are worthy of the same moral regard. That Israelis who are killed and Palestinians who are killed, Jews who are killed, and residents of the Gaza Strip who are killed, as well as the people from Thailand and China and elsewhere who have been killed, are worthy of the same lamentation. It's also important to maintain the difference between something that has, by philosophers for a very long time, been condemned and something that they have always recognized as potentially legitimate. And that is the difference between terrorist attacks that target civilians, that set out to kill and slaughter babies and grandmothers who are not combatants, and a military set of actions that aims at a military purpose, at military targets, even if those might entail civilian deaths, however tragic each one of those might be. And so I think that there's a very clear distinction between what Hamas did in slaughtering over 1,000 innocent civilians and how to think about a military response. Now, having said that, Israel is as responsible as any other state to make sure that in pursuing its legitimate military objectives, it does what it can to protect the civilian population. And it certainly is perfectly legitimate and indeed laudable to criticize the Israeli government in proportionate ways if it should fail to do that in the coming days. So it's possible here, I think, to guard our shared humanity while acknowledging the difference between one of the most bloody terrorist groups in the world and the government response this has provoked. More broadly, we can all understand the role and the importance of identity in the world while holding on to the importance of maintaining some universal values. And I think this entails recognizing that something like a one-state solution is likely unrealistic, and yet it can hold on to the hope that one day there will be both Israelis and Palestinians living in a thriving land and being able to maintain a durable peace with each other, however unlikely that might seem at the moment.
Thank you so much for listening to The Good Fight. Lots of listeners have been spreading the word about the show. If you too have been enjoying the podcast, please be like, rate the show on iTunes, tell your friends all about it, share it on Facebook or Twitter. And finally, please mail suggestions for great guests or comments about the show to goodfightpod@gmail.com. That's goodfightpod@gmail.com.
This recording carries a Creative Commons 4.0 international license. Thanks to Silent Partner for their song, Chess Pieces.